I reached into the supply closet and realized the yellow caution sign was gone. It was a small thing, just a folded piece of plastic, but it broke the rhythm of the shift. I stood in the narrow janitorial bay, staring at the empty hook on the wall where it always hung. I checked the corners of the room, looking behind the industrial buffer and the stacked boxes of toilet paper. Nothing. I checked my cart. I had the blue microfiber cloths, the spray bottles of glass cleaner, the trash bags, and the mop bucket filled with hot water and pine solvent. But no sign. Logic dictated someone from the day shift left it out on the floor. A spill by the food court, maybe, or a leak near the restrooms. I decided to proceed without it. The mall was locked, the gates were down, and I was the only person walking the concourse. No one was going to slip. I pushed the mop bucket out of the service hallway and into the south corridor. The rubber wheels squeaked against the polished terrazzo floor. The overhead lights were reduced to 30%, casting long, pale stretches of illumination separated by pools of deep shadow. The architecture of the south corridor always unsettled me during the night shift. It was a vast, sprawling promenade designed to handle thousands of weekend shoppers, flanked by shuttered sunglass kiosks and dark storefronts hidden behind metal security grills. Empty. The space felt too large. The silence was absolute, broken only by the sloshing of the water in my bucket and the squeak of my shoes. My routine was strictly defined. Start at the east end, work toward the west, empty the trash cans, mop the center tile, and ignore the mannequins standing in the dark windows. I dipped the mop head into the wringer, pressed the lever, and laid the damp cotton strings against the tile. I pushed forward in wide, sweeping arcs. 10 minutes into the corridor, I noticed the smell. It cut through the sharp chemical scent of the pine solvent. It was the scent of old, stagnant water, the kind you find in a clogged storm drain, mixed with the metallic tang of old pennies. I paused, resting my hands on the aluminum mop handle. I took a shallow breath, trying to isolate the source. It seemed to drift from the center of the promenade, near a cluster of leather massage chairs and a dead digital directory board. I pushed the bucket closer. The wheels dragged a bit, catching on the grout lines. As I passed the first trash can, I glanced at the floor. The overhead lights cast shadows from the cylindrical bins. I stopped again. The light fixture was directly above the bin, but the shadow did not pull at the base. It stretched outward, pointing straight down the corridor toward the digital directory. I looked at the next trash can 20 feet away. Its shadow also stretched outward, pointing in the same direction. It defied the angle of the light. I rubbed my eyes, blaming the late hour and the harsh fluorescent glare. I walked toward the directory board. The smell grew much stronger here. My stomach churned. Right at the base of the directory, spreading across 4 white terrazzo tiles, was a dark, wet smudge. It looked like dirty mop water, but the color was wrong. It was a murky, rust-colored brown. I assumed a roof leak. We had a storm 2 days prior. I brought the bucket over, wrung out the mop, and dragged it across the puddle. The water absorbed into the cotton, leaving the tile slick and clean. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and spent about 10 seconds scrolling to find a new podcast to play. The silence of them all was starting to press against my ears. I selected a track, locked the screen, and put the phone back in my pocket. When I looked down, the stain was back. It was not dripping from the ceiling. It was seeping up through the grout lines, thick and dark. But it was not in the same spot. It was 3 feet closer to my shoes. I took a step backward. The soles of my shoes squeaked loudly in the vast, empty space. I stared at the rust-colored puddle. The metallic smell of pennies was overwhelming now, making my eyes water. The air around me felt stagnant, as if the ventilation system had stopped blowing. I looked at the nearest trash can. The shadow had shifted. It was no longer pointing toward the directory. It was pointing directly at me. I looked at the massage chairs. The shadows cast by their bulky frames were elongated, stretching across the tile, all converging on the exact spot where I stood. A cold sweat broke out across my forehead. My breathing became shallow. The uncanny feeling of the vast corridor amplified. The distant storefronts felt like they were leaning inward. The darkness behind the security grills seemed to vibrate. I looked down at the stain again. It had not moved while I watched it. I kept my eyes locked on the murky liquid. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my phone, and looked at the screen for 2 seconds. Just 2 seconds. I looked back at the floor. The stain was another 3 feet closer. It was now just inches from the toes of my boots. My heart hammered against my ribs. Logic frayed, replaced by a raw, primal urge to run. But I knew if I ran, I would have to turn my back on it. I would have to look away. I gripped the mop handle. The rigid plastic and cold aluminum grounded me. I had a job to do. I was a night cleaner. This was just a spill. Using the routine as a shield, I plunged the mop into the bucket. I did not look away from the puddle. I wrung the mop out. I laid it over the stain. I scrubbed it. The dark water mixed with the pine solvent, turning into a foul, rusty slurry. I took a step backward, dragging the mop with me. I did not blink. I kept my eyes fixed on the wet tile. I pulled the bucket backward with my free hand. Step by step, I retreated down the south corridor. I wiped the floor methodically, erasing the wet marks of my own shoes, never letting my gaze drift from the spot where the stain had been. The process was agonizing. The corridor stretched for hundreds of feet. My arms ached from the tension. The smell of pennies lingered, hovering just at the edge of my nose. Every time I blinked, I expected the dark smudge to be right at my feet, but as long as I stared at the floor, nothing changed. The shadows of the trash cans stayed locked in my peripheral vision, still pointing at me, tracking my slow, backward progress. I reached the end of the promenade. My back bumped against the heavy metal door of the staff exit. I reached behind me, fumbling for the crash bar. I pushed it down. The door unlatched. I pulled the bucket through, yanked the mop inside, and let the heavy door swing shut. The latch engaged with a sharp metallic sound. I left the cart in the hallway and practically sprinted down the concrete stairs to the exterior door. I hit the final crash bar and burst out into the parking lot. The cool night breeze hit my face. The smell of asphalt and distant car exhaust filled my lungs. I walked rapidly to my sedan parked under the lone street lamp. I leaned my back against the driver's side door and let out a long, shaking breath. The terror drained out of my muscles. The night was quiet, normal, and safe. The wind rustled the leaves of the decorative trees near the sidewalk. The mall was locked behind me. I was outside. It was over. I reached into my pocket, pulled out my keys, and unlocked the car. I opened the door, slid into the driver's seat, and pulled the door shut. I put the key in the ignition. Then I inhaled, and the exact same stagnant, rotting water and copper stench poured from the fabric of the empty passenger seat beside me. The plastic soda bottle dropped from the C4 slot, but the coins just kept falling into the return tray. I stood in the narrow service hallway behind the food court, staring through the thick glass of the vending machine. The space was barely 3 feet wide, sandwiched between the back of the kitchens and the concrete load-bearing wall of the mall. The air was stale, choked with dust and the relentless droning hum of commercial refrigerators operating on the other side of the drywall. The only light came from the flickering fluorescent tube inside the vending machine itself, casting a pale glow over the metal racks and plastic coils. I was 20 minutes into the weekly restock. My metal cart sat beside me, loaded with flats of Diet Cola and sports drinks. The routine was precise. Unlock the master panel, pull the heavy door open, load the tracks, clear the bill validator, and test the coin mechanism. I had just deposited 2 quarters, a dime, and a nickel to test a 60-cent bend. The coil turned. The bottle fell. But the coins did not stop. A silver quarter dropped into the metal cup. Then another. Then a dime. Then a quarter. The metallic clatter echoed sharply off the bare concrete walls of the claustrophobic corridor. I frowned, reaching down into the cup. The metal was cold. I pulled out a handful of change, but more kept falling. The internal hopper was just dumping its entire payload. I pulled my master key from my belt, inserted it into the lock at the top of the door, and turned. I hauled the heavy front panel open. The glass swung outward, exposing the internal mechanics. The smell of ozone, old dust, and hot circuitry drifted from the machine. I looked at the coin mechanism mounted on the right side. The digital display was blank, but the internal plastic gears were spinning. The coins were feeding down the chute, dropping into the return cup at a steady, rhythmic pace. I reached for the power switch hidden behind the motherboard, intending to force a hard reset. That was when I saw the note. It was a small, square piece of yellow paper stuck to the side of the coin housing. The handwriting was cramped, written in black ink. It read, "If the coins don't stop dropping, do not move your feet." I paused, my hand hovering over the power switch. I read the words again. I did not recognize the handwriting. It was not from the shift supervisor. It was not a standard maintenance label. I stared at the spinning plastic gears. The protocol for a Jan hopper was to cut the power, manually clear the chute, and run a diagnostic. My training demanded I focus on the procedure. I ignored the strange note, assuming it was a prank from the previous vendor. I flipped the power switch. The fluorescent light inside the machine died. The cooling compressor ground to a halt, but the coins kept dropping. The rhythm did not change. Without electrical power, the gears should have stopped, but the silver discs kept sliding down the plastic chute, striking the metal cup in the dark. The sound seemed to grow louder, sharper, amplifying in the tight confines of the service hallway. The corridor felt smaller. The concrete walls seemed to press inward, the shadows lengthening around the edges of the vending machine. The air grew dense, making it difficult to draw a full breath. I stared into the dark interior of the unpowered machine, listening to the impossible, endless rain of coins. Then, the rhythm shifted. The dropping coins were no longer the only sound. From the far end of the service hallway, shrouded in total darkness, came a rhythmic tapping. Footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and synchronized exactly with the falling coins. A coin would hit the metal cup, and a shoe would strike the concrete floor. The hallway was a dead end. The only way in was the door 20 feet behind me, and the only way out was the door I stood next to. I had not heard the door open. I froze, my hands still resting inside the dark vending machine. The professional discipline that guided my shift vanished, replaced by a disorienting, suffocating panic. The footsteps drew closer. They did not sound like work boots. They sounded hard, like the scuff of bare bone against the cement. A coin dropped. A footstep landed. A coin dropped. A footstep landed. The walls felt like they were inches from my shoulders. The air was so thick with dust, I could taste it on my tongue. The footsteps crossed the halfway point of the corridor. I tried to look down the hall, but the darkness was impenetrable. I could only hear the approach. The rhythm accelerated. The coins began spilling faster, a rapid clatter of metal. The footsteps matched the pace, turning into a frantic, disjointed shuffle that rapidly closed the distance. The footsteps stopped directly behind me. The coins kept falling, but the walking ceased. I felt a drop in temperature, a freezing wave that rolled off whatever was standing behind my back. The air displaced against my neck. I stopped breathing. The note on the yellow paper flashed in my mind. "Do not move your feet." A dry, rasping voice spoke directly into my right ear. The breath smelled like old copper and stagnant dirt. 60 cents, the voice whispered. The sheer terror shattered my restraint. I did not care about the note. I did not care about the machine. I ripped my hand out of the interior, letting the heavy glass door swing shut on its own. I spun around, grabbed the handle of my supply cart, and shoved it blindly into the dark to create an obstacle. I turned toward the exit door just 5 feet away. I lunged forward, desperate to sprint out of the hallway. I pushed my weight forward to run, but my legs did not respond. My torso leaned toward the door, my arms reaching for the exit handle, but my boots remained fused to the concrete floor. The muscles in my calves and thighs locked, rigid and unyielding. I tried to lift my right foot, straining with everything I had, but it would not lift. The darkness enveloped me. I stood frozen in the narrow corridor, leaning forward, my hands grasping at empty air. Behind me, the vending machine door swung back open. The voice whispered the price again, closer this time, brushing against the collar of my shirt. I squeezed my eyes shut, paralyzed in the dark. feeling the vibration travel up through the soles of my boots as the final singular coin scraped against the metal bottom of the return tray. The summer display mannequin had its left wrist turned inward. I stood on the carpeted second floor of the closed department store, staring at the plastic limb. My job was straightforward. I dressed the displays, pinned the loose fabric to make the clothes look tailored, and adjusted the spotlights before the morning staff arrived. I had been on my feet for 7 hours. The soles of my shoes ached, and my eyes burned from the harsh track lighting above. The store was massive. The second floor held women's apparel, stretching out in a vast open layout. Without the daytime crowds, the space felt too large. Aisles of clothing racks formed dark, repetitive mazes that faded into the shadows. The only light came from the scattered display sections I was working on. It was quiet. The air conditioning was turned off for the night, leaving the air stale and warm, smelling of new denim and dust. I looked at the wrist again. Mannequins are cast in rigid fiberglass or thick plastic. Their joints disconnect at the shoulder and the wrist, using metal pegs to lock the pieces together. They do not bend. They hold one pose. This one was wearing a yellow floral dress. Her arm rested against her hip, but the hand twisted inward, the palm facing the wrong angle. I blamed my own blurry vision and the long shift. I figured the previous stylist failed to lock the metal peg into the socket, leaving the hand loose. I stepped onto the low white platform. I reached out to adjust the sleeve of the floral dress. The fabric felt rough against my fingers. I needed to smooth a wrinkle near the waist. I pressed my hand against the side of the mannequin to hold it steady while I pulled the fabric tight. The surface under the dress yielded. It did not feel like hard fiberglass. It gave way under my palm, pressing inward like soft tissue. It felt warm. My stomach turned. A wave of nausea hit the back of my throat. I pulled my hand away, dropping the fabric. I stared at the side of the yellow dress. The material settled back into place. I took a breath, trying to calm down. I told myself it was just cheap foam padding. Sometimes the company sent display units wrapped in dense foam to fill out larger clothing sizes. The heat of the spotlights must have warmed the material. I rubbed my eyes, feeling foolish. I was letting the isolation of the massive floor get to me. I grabbed my box of metal pins from the floor. I decided to leave the wrinkle alone. I turned my back to the yellow dress and walked down the main aisle toward the escalator to fetch my rolling cart. The walk felt longer than usual. The soft carpet absorbed my footsteps, making my movements silent. I passed rows of dark winter coats and tall racks of evening gowns. The shadows seemed to stretch across the aisles. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, looking at the metal gate pulled across the top of the escalator. When I reached the escalator, I grabbed the handle of my metal cart. I turned around to push it back to the display. I stopped. The second floor was dotted with 20 different mannequins, placed in groups of 2 or 3 at the corners of the main walkways. Earlier in the night, I had positioned them to face the various aisles, directing their plastic gazes toward the merchandise. Now, they were all facing the escalator. I stood still, gripping the handle of the cart. The silence of the vast floor pressed against my ears. I looked at a pair of figures 20 feet away, dressed in activewear. Their bodies were turned toward me. I looked further down the aisle, toward the denim section. 3 more figures stood on their white platforms. They were also angled toward the metal gate where I stood. My chest tightened. The air in the store felt thick, hard to breathe. I tried to find a logical reason. Maybe I misremembered my own work. Maybe the overnight manager came up here while I was in the restroom and moved them for a new floor plan. But managers did not move displays without a printed directive. I let go of the cart. I did not want to walk back down the aisle. I did not want to pass them. But my styling kit, my keys, and my jacket were sitting on the platform next to the yellow dress. I kept my eyes glued to the floor. I refused to look up. I refused to look at their plastic faces. I focused on the geometric patterns in the carpet. I walked slowly, tracing the lines of the carpet with my shoes. I passed the activewear display. I saw the edge of their white platform in my lower vision. I kept walking. I passed the denim section. I saw the hems of the jeans. The air grew more stagnant the closer I got to the center of the floor. I felt a knot in my stomach. The nausea returned, stronger this time. I heard a dry scrape of plastic against plastic somewhere to my left. I did not stop. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes fixed on my own shoes. I reached the display with the yellow dress. I saw my black styling kit resting on the edge of the platform. I just wanted to grab it and leave. I did not care about finishing the section. I did not care about the shift. I just wanted to get off the second floor. I crouched down to grab the handle of the kit. The spotlight mounted on the ceiling shone directly down, casting a bright circle of light onto the floor. I reached for my bag. As my hand closed around the strap, I looked at the pristine white surface of the plastic platform the mannequin was bolted to. The platform was covered in a thin layer of gray dust from the store renovations. But the dust was not smooth. Right next to the metal bolt that held the plastic leg in place, the gray dust was pushed aside, revealing the stark white plastic underneath. I stared at the marks. They were clear, distinct impressions left in the dust. 5 bare, human toes, gripping the edge of the plastic base. Monitor 4 showed the decorative fountain at 2 in the morning, but my desk clock clearly said 3:15. I sat in the security booth, a small concrete box located in the basement of the shopping center. The room was barely large enough to hold a desk, a chair, and a server rack. It smelled of old coffee, burnt dust, and the heat radiating from the computer towers. The walls were painted a dull beige, and the only window was a thick pane of glass set into the metal door, looking out into a dark cement hallway. My job was to watch a grid of 12 screens. Most of the cameras pointed at empty parking garages, locked loading docks, and dark retail corridors. It was a boring routine. I drank cheap coffee and marked the hour in a paper logbook. I leaned forward in the office chair and looked closer at Monitor 4. The screen displayed the main courtyard on the ground level. The large stone fountain sat in the middle of the frame, surrounded by potted plants and tile benches. The digital timestamp in the bottom right corner of the video feed read 2 hours 0 minutes and 14 seconds. I checked my phone. It was 3:15. I looked at the digital clock on the desk. 3:15. I tapped my finger against the glass of Monitor 4. The image did not change. The water in the fountain cascaded over the stone tiers in a smooth, continuous loop. I assumed the video feed had frozen, or the server was experiencing a software glitch, delaying the playback. It happened sometimes when the old network routers got too hot. I grabbed my mouse, planning to restart the camera software. The temperature in the small room dropped. It was not a gradual change. It was a violent plunge. The heat radiating from the computer towers vanished. The air turned brittle and sharp. I gasped, and the cold burned the back of my throat. I exhaled, and a thick plume of white mist plumed from my mouth, drifting toward the glowing screens. I pulled my arms tight against my chest, shivering. The small vent in the ceiling above my head began to blow freezing air, spitting tiny white ice crystals onto the desk. I looked at the metal door. A thin layer of white frost was spreading across the edges of the thick glass window, crawling toward the center like a spiderweb. I turned my attention back to the monitors, looking for a reason. I looked at Monitor 4. The timestamp still read 2 in the morning, but the courtyard was no longer empty. A shape stood beside the stone fountain. It was tall, too tall to be a person. Its edges blurred and distorted like a bad signal. It lacked defining features, appearing as a dark smudge of static against the gray tile. I gripped the edge of the desk. The cold in the booth was painful now, making my joints ache. My teeth began to chatter. I watched the screen. The blurred shape raised a long dark arm. It pointed directly at the camera lens mounted on the courtyard wall. I needed to document this. The management required proof of any network errors or unauthorized entry. My hand shook as I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I opened the camera app, switched to video mode, and held it up to record Monitor 4. On the screen, the blurred shape dropped its arm. It turned away from the fountain and began to run. It moved with unnatural speed, a dark blur tearing across the courtyard tiles. I tracked its path on the monitor grid. It crossed camera 2, the east corridor. It crossed camera 7, the service elevator lobby. It was heading straight for the basement stairs. It was heading toward the security hallway. Panic seized my chest. I dropped my phone on the desk. I stood up, kicking the chair backward. I lunged across the small room and slammed my hand against the metal door. I grabbed the deadbolt and shoved it into the lock position. The metal latch engaged with a dull strike. I backed away from the door, my boots slipping slightly on the ice crystals covering the floor. I stood trapped between the locked door and the desk, my breath coming in rapid, freezing clouds. I stared at the frosted glass of the window, waiting for a shadow to appear on the other side. The radio on my desk crackled. The green light on the receiver flashed. The static hissed, breaking the silence of the freezing room. "Base, this is level 2. It was the shift supervisor." His voice came through the speaker, distorted by the static. He was doing his routine patrol on the upper floors. "Base, do you copy? Need a status check on the main feed." I looked at the radio. I needed to answer. I needed to tell him to lock down the floor, to get out of the building. I reached my shaking hand over the desk. My fingers brushed against the cold plastic of the microphone. I pressed the button on the side to open the channel. Before I could speak, the supervisor keyed his mic again. I stood frozen in the freezing booth, my thumb pressing hard against the talk button, listening to the wet, rhythmic sound of the supervisor's teeth violently chattering together through the speaker. The man in the yellow coat walked past my phone case kiosk for the third time in 10 minutes. I stood behind the glass counter, holding a small plastic broom. The mall was quiet. It was late, an hour before closing time. The corridors were empty. My kiosk sat in the middle of the South Promenade. It was a dead zone for foot traffic. The floor was covered in large white tiles. The lights overhead cast a harsh glare on my glass display cases. I sold cheap plastic phone covers and screen protectors. It was boring work. I watched the man walk away from me. He wore a bright yellow winter coat. The coat was out of place. The air conditioning in the mall kept the temperature cool, but the air was not cold enough for winter gear. He kept his head down. His hands were stuffed deep in his pockets. He walked past the closed pretzel stand. He walked past the dark jewelry store. He reached the end of the promenade and turned left down the service corridor. The service corridor led to a locked fire door. It was a dead end. I knew this because I took my breaks back there. 3 minutes passed. I looked down at the fake grass mat under my feet. I saw a piece of lint. I pushed my broom against the mat. Then I saw the yellow coat in the corner of my eye. He approached from the right side of the promenade. He walked past the kiosk again, heading in the exact same direction. I stopped sweeping. I leaned my hands against the glass counter. I looked at the wide, empty tile floor. There was no physical way for him to circle back without passing me. The promenade was a straight line. Unless he had a master key to the service doors and walked through the back maintenance hallways, he could not be on the right side of my kiosk. I shook my head. I told myself he was a lost contractor. Or maybe I just lost track of time, and it was a different person wearing the same bright coat. I let out a dry laugh. The isolation of the late shift always played tricks on the mind. I focused on my routine. I bent down and swept the small square of fake grass under the display racks. The plastic bristles of the broom gathered dust and small bits of trash into a pile. I pushed the dirt into a small dustpan. I dumped the dirt into the trash can kept under the register. The ambient hum of the mall ventilation system droned on. It was a low, constant vibration that settled deep in the background. I arranged a row of clear phone cases on the metal hooks. I made sure the gaps between the cases were even. I wiped a smudge off the glass counter with my sleeve. I checked the register drawer. I counted a small stack of receipt paper. I kept my hands busy. I ignored the vast, empty space around my kiosk. I wanted the shift to end. Then he walked past for the fourth time. He came from the right again. He moved at the same slow pace. I stood up straight. I gripped the plastic handle of the broom. I opened my mouth to ask if he needed directions. I wanted to break the silence. I wanted to prove to myself that he was just a normal guy wandering the mall. He turned his head toward the kiosk. I looked at his face. The words stopped in my throat. His features were wrong. The skin was blurred. It looked stretched downward, as if someone had dragged a wet sponge across a fresh painting. The eyes, the nose, and the mouth were smeared streaks of flesh tone mixing into the yellow collar of his coat. There was no bone structure. There were no distinct lines, just wet, running colors. My stomach lurched. The air in my lungs turned stale. A sharp, chalky flavor flooded my mouth. It tasted like burnt paper and old dirt. It coated my teeth. It settled deep on the back of my tongue. I closed my mouth and swallowed, but the bitter ash flavor only grew stronger. It tasted like a dead campfire. He did not look away. The smeared face stayed angled toward me as he walked. Then he stopped. He stood 20 feet from the kiosk, right in the middle of the white tile floor. He turned away from me and faced the blank drywall of an empty retail unit. He stood still. His arms hung loose at his sides. He did not move a single muscle. I dropped the broom. The plastic handle clattered against the floor. I crouched down behind the glass display case. My knees hit the thin fake grass mat. I kept my back pressed hard against the metal cabinet of the register. I breathed through my nose, trying to keep quiet. The taste of ash was suffocating. I felt grit grinding between my teeth. I clamped my jaw shut. I waited for the sound of his shoes on the tile. I waited for him to walk away. The silence stretched out. The low drone of the ventilation system cut out. The air grew still. Then the overhead lights at the far end of the promenade shut down. The long corridor plunged into darkness. A second later, another grid of lights turned off. The shadows crept closer to the kiosk. The darkness moved in a straight line, swallowing the bright storefronts one by one. The lights were shutting down in a sequence, heading straight for my position. I stayed crouched on the floor. I curled my arms around my legs. The bitter flavor in my mouth turned into a thick, dry coating. I could barely swallow. My throat burned. The lights 30 feet away shut off. Then the lights 20 feet away shut off. The lights directly over the kiosk went black. I was in the dark. The only glow came from the dim emergency bulbs, spaced far apart on the distant walls. The air smelled like an old fire. The ash flavor was thick on my palate, making me gag. I pressed my hands against my mouth. I stayed low to the floor, hiding behind the metal cabinet. I heard a noise directly above the kiosk. It was a wet, slow, tearing sound, like thick fabric ripping at the seams. It came from the ceiling tiles right over my head. I did not want to look. I wanted to stay hidden behind the counter. But the tearing sound grew louder, accompanied by a soft, rhythmic dripping hitting the glass display case. I took a shallow breath, choking on the dry air. I forced my head to tilt back. I looked up into the black space above the register. The final reality was the gritty, dry sensation of falling ash landing flat on my open tongue. The freight elevator jolted to a halt halfway between the parking garage and the basement. The metal walls shuddered. The vibration traveled up through the soles of my boots. The main overhead light flickered and died, leaving the cab bathed in the dim yellow glow of the emergency battery panel. I stood alone in the center of the large steel box. My job was routine maintenance. I rode the cars, checked the rail lubrication, and inspected the door tracks. The stop was not part of the schedule. I pressed the lobby button on the control panel. The plastic button did not light up. I pressed the basement button. Nothing happened. The digital floor indicator above the doors remained blank. I unclipped the radio from my belt and pressed the microphone button. Static hissed through the speaker. The thick concrete walls of the shaft blocked the signal. I clipped the radio back to my belt. I pulled a thick metal flashlight from my tool bag. I clicked it on and aimed the beam at the ceiling hatch. I needed to see what tripped the fail-safe. I climbed onto the metal handrail lining the back wall of the cab. I pushed the ceiling hatch open. I pulled myself up through the narrow square opening and crawled onto the roof of the elevator car. The air in the maintenance shaft was cold. It smelled of old grease, raw concrete, and iron dust. I stood up. keeping my head clear of the thick steel suspension cables running up into the darkness. The shaft was a vertical tunnel of gray cement, stretching up to the 12th floor and dropping down to the sub-basement. I shined the light on the main guide rails bolted to the walls. The grease was fresh. The rollers were intact. I moved the beam to the braking mechanism mounted on the top edge of the car frame. I assumed the primary brake pad had clamped the rail too early. It was a common issue with older mechanical systems. Dust builds up on the speed governor, the sensor trips, and the cast iron brake shoes locked the car in place. I crouched near the edge of the roof, balancing on the corrugated metal. I reached out to inspect the tension spring on the brake arm. Then a voice called out my name from the black pit below. It drifted up through the narrow gap between the side of the elevator car and the concrete wall. It was not a shout. It was a clear, conversational tone. It sounded just like my mother. She had been dead for a decade. The voice was soft, asking if I was finished with my chores. My hand stopped moving. A cold knot formed in my stomach. The shaft was locked. No one could get into the pit without the access key. I leaned over the edge of the roof and aimed a flashlight down into the gap. The beam cut through the floating dust, illuminating 50 feet of empty concrete wall before fading into total blackness. There was no one down there. As I stared into the dark, my sense of balance failed. The world spun. The floor of the elevator roof tilted to the left. The shift was subtle, maybe an inch, but it threw my stance off. I staggered backward. My boots slipped on a patch of old machine oil. I fell hard to my knees, dropping the flashlight. The heavy metal cylinder rolled toward the edge and stopped against a raised seam. I grabbed a thick steel winch cable with both hands. The braided metal dug deep into my palms. I held my breath. The car was leaning. The right side of the roof raised up, dropping the left side closer to the concrete wall. The voice called my name again. It came from right below the edge of the car this time, just out of sight. The tone was impatient. It told me to come down. The tilt worsened. The massive metal frame of the elevator groaned under the uneven strain. The brake shoes scraped loud against the guide rail. I pressed my chest flat against the cold, greasy roof. I clung to the vertical cable. I could not move. If I shifted my weight, the car would slide further. I stared at the gap between the roof and the concrete wall. The gap was growing wider as the car tilted. I dug the toes of my boots into the corrugated metal, trying to anchor myself. I waited for the drop. A pale arm reached up from the darkness of the gap. The skin was smooth and white. It lacked hair or texture. The arm was too long, stretching up past the edge of the roof. The hand had too many joints in the fingers. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the cold fingers to grab my ankle. I held tight onto the steel cable, waiting to be pulled down into the pit. But the hand did not reach for me. It bypassed my boots. The long fingers wrapped around the cast iron brake assembly, bolted to the edge of the car. The pale arm pulled. The thick iron bent inward, tearing away from the metal frame. I opened my eyes. The threat was not focused on me. The pale arm was reaching higher, pulling itself up to get to the massive shifting shadow that blocked out the shaft above my head. I looked up into the dark space above. The final reality was the deafening screech of snapping steel cables ringing deep inside my ears. The reflection of the skylight in the wet floor did not match the glass panels on the ceiling above. I drove the battery-powered floor buffer across the food court. The machine was a massive industrial scrubber. I stood on the back platform, my hands resting on the rubber steering wheel. The floor was covered in wide square tiles. The food court was a giant open space, taking up the dead center of the mall. The ceiling was fast food counters lined the far walls, hidden behind pulled-down security gates. Dark digital menu boards hung over the empty kitchens. The dining area was filled with hundreds of metal chairs and small tables. The night crew had stacked the chairs on top of the tables to clear the tiles for my shift. My job, the machine deposited a line of chemical polish, scrubbed it with a rotating pad, and used a rubber squeegee to leave a smooth, wet trail behind me. The smell of the wax was sharp, like old plastic and rubbing alcohol. I drove in the vibration of the motor traveled up through the soles of my boots. The room was isolated. The silence was absolute, broken only by the low hum of the scrubber and the wet drag of the squeegee. I turned the wheel. The machine swung around in a slow, wide arc. I drove back toward the pattern was as it required. I drove under the large skylight. The glass dome was made of curved panels held together by thick steel ribs. It allowed the faint glow of the city street lamps to filter down into the dark mall. I looked down at the liquid acted. I stopped staring at the path ahead and looked closer at the reflection. The image of the skylight in the wet wax was a perfect flat square. It had no curved glass. It had no steel ribs. I gripped the steering wheel. I told myself it was just a trick of the liquid. The wax was thick. It spread over the deep grout lines between the tiles, causing the light to bend and distort. The curved dome looked square because the surface of the floor was uneven. It was basic probability, a trick of the angles, the dim light, and the curved surface of the liquid. I forced my mind to focus on the statistics of refraction. I kept my hands on the wheel. I kept the machine moving. I drove out from under the skylight, leaving the distorted reflection behind. I approached the center seating area. This section was surrounded by a decorative brass railing. The tables here were bolted to the floor. I drove the buffer in a wide circle around the perimeter. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, guiding the front of the machine along the base of the metal rail. In the corner of my vision, the wet floor reflected the dining area. I did not look directly at it. I watched it in my peripheral view. The reflection in the polish showed chairs scattered across the tiles. Several tables were knocked over, their metal legs pointing toward the ceiling. Dark, uneven patches coated the floor near the ruined tables. I turned my head and looked at the real dining area behind the brass railing. The chairs were perfectly stacked. The tables were upright and clean. The tile floor was bare. A cold detachment settled over me. The isolation of the giant food court made everything feel distant and unreal. The air felt stale. I felt a bizarre. I tried to bargain with logic again. I told myself it was catching the dim security lights from the food counters. The light bound. It was a rare statistical alignment of shadows and light playing on the edges of my vision. It was a double I looked away from the seating area. I watched the wet trail spreading from the rubber squeegee. I saw the shadow of my own machine in the wet floor. The real floor buffer was a smooth, round tank made of yellow plastic. It had soft edges and a compact design. But the shadow spreading across the reflection in the wax was different. It looked like a towering pile of broken metal. It stretched far across the tiles, dwarfing the reflection of my own body. The shape in the wax had no steering wheel. It had no rubber mat. I stopped the machine. I turned the key. The power cut off. The vibration under my boots ceased. The low hum of the quiet of the massive room rushed in, pressing against my ears. The air smelled of sharp chemicals. I stood on the back of the dead machine, staring down into the dark liquid. I needed to prove the reflection was just an optical error. I needed to map the angles and show my brain that the real world was fine. I stepped off the rubber mat. My boots hit the dry tile next to the wet path. The cold surface grounded me. I walked toward the edge of the liquid wax. I stopped inches from the fresh polish. I looked straight down into the wet floor. In the reflection, the food court was perfect. The chairs were neatly stacked on the tables. The tiles were clean and unbroken. The floor buffer behind me looked normal, its smooth yellow plastic shining in the dim light. The reflection showed a pristine, empty mall. I lifted my head to look out at the real room, my fingers finding the rough, splintered wood of an overturned chair. The secondary return vent blew a thick puff of black dust straight into my flashlight beam. I was crawling on my hands and knees through an aluminum duct. The metal tube ran above the retail stores on the first floor. It was 2 feet wide and barely 18 inches tall. My job was routine repair. The air conditioning for the east wing was failing. Volume was failing, and the pressure sensors indicated a blockage in the secondary return line. I needed to find the manual dampers hidden deep in the ceiling architecture and check their alignment. The space was restrictive. The cold metal pressed against my shoulders every time I shifted my weight. My kneecaps scraped against the corrugated bottom. The air inside the duct smelled of old zinc and dry lint. The heat from the stores below radiated up through the thin metal, making the narrow tunnel stifling. Sweat ran down my face, stinging my eyes. I held a thick metal flashlight in my right hand. I moved by pushing the flashlight forward, dragging my right knee up, then bracing my left hand against the sidewall to pull my left leg forward. It was a slow, agonizing crawl. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark tunnel. The duct stretched out straight ahead, vanishing into absolute black. I reached a junction where a smaller side vent joined the main line. As I passed the opening, the vent blew the black dust into my face. It coated my wet skin. It stuck to my lips. It smelled like burnt soil. I paused, resting my forehead against my forearm. I used logic to calm my rising heart rate. A rat probably died in the main filter, breaking the mesh and allowing dirt to bypass the system. Or a large section of the old fiberglass insulation collapsed inside the fan housing, blowing decayed material into the clean lines. It was just debris caught in a strange backdraft. I wiped the grit from my eyes and prepared to crawl forward. Without warning, the air pressure spiked. It hit the space behind my nose with a sharp pain. My ears popped. The air inside the tight metal tube grew dense. I aimed the flashlight ahead of me. The thick puff of black dust did not settle on the metal floor. The beam illuminated the particles swirling in the air. They formed a tight circle, spinning faster and faster, defying the normal airflow of the duct. A deep vibration traveled through the metal floor, pressing hard against my kneecaps. It came from the dark tunnel behind my boots. Something shifted in the metal shaft behind me, blocking the path I had just taken. The vibration felt like two massive sheets of steel grinding together. The walls of the duct began to bow inward. The aluminum panels beside my shoulders groaned under an immense weight. The top panel pushed down, scraping against the fabric of my work shirt. The space grew even smaller. The metal pressed closer to my sides, trapping my arms near my chest. The crushing sensation made it hard to draw a breath. The air pressure continued to rise, pressing against my eardrums. The black dust swirled closer to my face, filling the beam of the flashlight with a chaotic storm of dark grit. I needed to document the structural failure. Management required video evidence of duct collapse before approving invasive demolition of the ceiling. It was standard protocol. I shifted my weight, trying to free my left hand. The metal wall pressed hard against my bicep. I pushed back against the bowing aluminum, forcing my hand down toward my cargo pocket. My fingers fumbled with the flap. I pulled out my phone. The screen glowed in the dark, casting a pale light over the swirling dust. I opened the camera app. I hit the record button. I pointed the lens toward the black cloud spinning just inches from my face. I needed to capture the pressure anomaly and the bending walls to prove the sector was unsafe. The metal ceiling pressed down harder, forcing my head to tilt forward. The aluminum dug into the back of my neck. The air grew so thick I could barely force it into my lungs. Panic overtook my training. I dropped the flashlight. It rolled against my wrist, the beam shining uselessly against the side wall. I tried to push myself backward. I dug my boots into the corrugated floor, trying to slide my body in reverse down the tunnel. I needed to get away from the swirling dust and the crushing metal. As I pushed backward, the air pressure reversed. The dense, suffocating air stopped blowing in my face. A vacuum formed in the dark shaft behind me. It sucked the air backward, pulling the dust past my ears. The phone slipped in my sweating palm. The recording cut out on the exact sensation of an immense unseen force pulling the hair on the back of my head straight into the dark void behind me. A decorative fake ficus tree dropped a ring of real decaying brown leaves onto the tile floor. I stood in the center of the main shopping atrium, holding the brass nozzle of a long green watering hose. The atrium was a cavernous, empty space. The ceiling was made of massive glass panels, rising 3 stories above the ground. At night, The glass turned into a black mirror, reflecting the dim security lights scattered across the lower floor. The air conditioning was shut down for the night, leaving the vast room warm and stagnant. My job was indoor plant care. I worked alone from midnight to 6 in the morning, pulling the hose from a wall valve and dragging it from one massive planter box to another. I squeezed the brass handle. A stream of cold water soaked the dark soil of a real fern. I released the handle and let the hose drop. I wiped the sweat from my forehead with the back of my hand. My arms ached. My back was stiff. The shift was long, and the isolation of the huge, quiet building always made me feel small. I turned my attention to the next planter box. It sat near a wooden bench, right in the middle of the wide tile walkway. This box held a fake ficus tree. The mall used synthetic plants in high-traffic areas where real ones would get damaged. The ficus had a thick trunk molded from hard plastic. The branches were wire covered in brown tape. The leaves were stamped silk, glued to the wire stems. The base of the tree was buried in a block of dense foam, hidden under a layer of small white decorative rocks. It was a fake plant. It did not need water. It did not grow. It did not die. But a perfect ring of dry, brown leaves rested on the tile around the base of the planter. I walked closer, the rubber soles of my work boots making no sound on the floor. I stopped 2 feet away from the planter. I looked down. The leaves were real. They were curled at the edges, brittle and dead. The veins in the dry plant tissue were dark and cracked. I rubbed my eyes. My brain was foggy from lack of sleep. I blamed my own fatigue. I tried to find a logical reason for the mess. The day shift maintenance crew probably carried a dead plant past this spot and spilled the debris. Or maybe teenagers brought leaves in from the parking lot as a prank. Then I remembered the employee manual. It was a thick binder kept in the basement break room. When I started the job, the manager told me to ignore the main chapters and only read the safety sheets. But on my first night, bored and waiting for the shift to start, I flipped to the back cover. A single sheet of yellow paper was taped to the cardboard. It was a typed addendum. It had one rule regarding the synthetic displays. If the artificial foliage sheds, do not step on the debris. I had laughed when I read it. I assumed it was a joke left by an older worker. Standing in the massive, dark atrium, I was not laughing. The silence of the empty mall pressed against my ears. I needed to break the quiet. I needed to normalize the situation to keep my nerves calm. Just some kids making a mess, I said aloud. My voice bounced off the glass ceiling, echoing into the dark upper levels. The sound of my own words felt thin and weak. I forced myself to speak louder. Day shift always leaves their trash for the night crew. It is just dry leaves. Nothing to worry about. I walked over to my supply cart parked near the wall. The wheels squeaked as I pushed it toward the planter. I grabbed a plastic dustpan and a small broom from the bottom shelf. I kept talking. Sweep it up, dump it out, finish the section. Go home and sleep. I approached the planter again. I knelt down on the tile to sweep. As my face got closer to the edge of the box, a terrible smell drifted up from the white decorative rocks. It was faint at first. It smelled like old, stagnant garbage left in a hot room. I wrinkled my nose. I leaned in an inch closer to inspect the rocks. The smell spiked, turning into the sharp, vile stench of rotting meat. I gagged, turning my head away. The air around the planter was thick and sour. I stood up, taking a step back. I looked at the white rocks. They were no longer dry. A dark, oily slime coated the stones, seeping up from the foam block hidden underneath. I looked up at the branches of the fake ficus. The silk leaves were changing. The green fabric began to curl inward, folding like dying skin. The edges of the fake leaves turned a sickly yellow, then a bruised black. The plastic stem sagged. I watched a stamped fabric leaf detach from the wire branch. It drifted down, landing on the wet rocks. As soon as it touched the slime, the fabric dissolved into a dark, foul sludge. The smell of rotting meat flooded the air around me. It was so strong it made my eyes water. It coated the back of my throat. "Chemical spill," I said. My voice was shaking now. I spoke fast, trying to drown out my own fear. Someone poured a solvent in the planter. It is melting the plastic. It is just a bad chemical reaction making a bad smell. I gripped the handle of the small broom. I did not want to be near the melting tree. I did not want to breathe the sour air. But I needed to finish the job. If I left a mess, I would get written up. I focused on the task to shield my mind from the rising panic. I bent my knees, keeping my torso upright to avoid the worst of the smell. I held the dustpan near the ring of dead leaves. I held the dustpan near the dustpan. I held the dustpan near the ring of dead leaves. I used the broom to gather the brittle brown debris. I was careful to keep my boots flat on the clean tile. I swept the leaves into a small pile. The bristles of the broom scraped against the floor. The fake ficus tree above me shifted. The wire branches bent downward, sagging under a weight that was not there. More silk leaves turned black and dropped onto the slime. The stench grew unbearable, filling the massive open space of the atrium. "Almost done," I whispered, holding my breath. "Just sweeping up the trash. Just doing my job." I pushed the pile of dead leaves into the plastic dustpan. I lifted the pan, turned away from the rotting planter, and dumped the debris into the trash bag hanging from my cart. I placed the broom and the pan back on the bottom shelf. I wiped my sweating palms on my work pants. The air was still thick with the smell of decay, but the floor was clean. I had followed the rule. I had not stepped on the debris. I grabbed the handle of the supply cart. I took one step backward to pivot the cart around. My work boot broke something brittle on the floor. I stopped. I did not move a single muscle. I stopped. I did not move a single muscle. I stopped. The rationalizations vanished from my mind. The false comfort of the routine dissolved. I stared straight ahead at the metal frame of my cart. I knew what the feeling under my heel was. I had missed one single brown leaf during my sweeping. It was resting just outside the ring, hiding against the dark outline, and my heel was planted flat on top of it. I did not attempt to run. I did not try to lift my boot. I knew the rule, and I knew I had broken it. I let go of the cart handle. I let my arms hang loose at my sides. I stood perfectly still on the tile floor. The final reality was the overwhelming, suffocating stench of rotting meat filling my lungs with every shallow breath. The motion sensor faucet in the install turned on by itself. I stood near the door of the men's restroom, holding a wet mop. The space was incredibly tight. It was a narrow, windowless rectangle located in the service hallway behind the main food court. 4 toilet stalls lined the left wall. 3 porcelain sinks lined the right wall. A long mirror stretched across the wall directly above the sinks. The ceiling was low, fitted with harsh fluorescent light panels that buzzed with a constant low drone. The air was thick with the chemical burn of raw bleach and cheap pine soap. I was at the end of my cleaning routine. The floor was wet. The toilets were scrubbed. I was preparing to empty the trash bin near the door and leave. Then the water started running. I looked at the far end of the room. The third sink, the one closest to the back wall, was pouring a steady stream of cold water into the drain. The water splashed against the white porcelain. There was no one else in the room. The stall doors were open. The space under the metal partitions was empty. I gripped the wooden handle of the mop. I assumed it was a simple hardware failure. The optic sensors on the faucets were cheap. The moisture from the hot water pipes often seeped behind the plastic housing, causing the wires to short out. It happened in the north wing restrooms a few weeks ago. A false signal triggers the valve, and the water runs until someone manually resets the battery pack under the sink. I rested the mop against the wall. I walked toward the far end of the narrow room to fix the sensor. My work boots squeaked against the wet floor tiles. I took a step, and the rubber sole made a sharp, high sound. A second squeak echoed off the tiled walls. I stopped walking. I stood perfectly still between the first stall and the first sink. The water continued to splash into the distant basin. I listened to the quiet room. I told myself it was just an echo. The hard ceramic walls and the low ceiling made sound bounce in strange ways. I took another step forward. My boot squeaked. A fraction of a second later, Another squeak sounded. It did not sound like a hollow echo bouncing off a wall. It sounded like a heavy work boot pressing down on the wet floor, coming from the exact same spot where I was standing. Cold panic flooded my chest. My breath caught in my throat. I stared down at the floor. The tiles were small white hexagons, joined by dark gray grout. I focused on the geometric pattern. I refused to look up. I knew the long mirror was right next to my shoulder. If I turned my head to the right, I would see the entire room reflected in the glass. I kept my chin tucked down. I needed to test the sound. I slowly lifted my left foot and placed it down on a dry patch of tile. There was no squeak. I tapped the toe of my boot against the ceramic floor. A tap sounded right next to my ear. The mimic was perfect, matching my movement with an imperceptible delay. I felt a drop of cold sweat roll down the side of my neck. The air in the tight bathroom felt colder. The smell of bleach stung my eyes. The drone of the fluorescent lights above me seemed to grow louder, vibrating against my skull. I did not want to fix the sink anymore. I did not care about the running water. I just wanted to back out of the room. I began to walk backward, moving slowly toward the entrance door. I kept my eyes fixed on my own boots. I dragged my feet to avoid making sharp sounds. The mimic dragged its feet exactly in time with mine. The soft scuff of rubber on tile surrounded me, isolating me in a bubble of duplicated noise. As I passed the middle sink, I saw a shadow move in the very bottom edge of my peripheral vision. I did not turn my head. I kept my eyes locked on the floor. But the lower corner of the long mirror was in my line of sight. Reflected in the glass, standing at the far sink where the water was running, was a figure. It wore the same dark blue work uniform I wore. It had the same exact posture, standing rigid with its arms resting at its sides. But its head was wrong. The neck was bent completely backward. The face pointed straight up at the ceiling panels. It stood entirely still while the water poured into the basin beside its hands. My heart hammered violently against my ribs. I could not reach the main door without passing the first sink, and the reflection terrified me too much to turn around. The supply closet was directly behind me, built into the back wall of the restroom. I reached my hand behind my back. My fingers brushed against the metal doorknob of the closet. I turned the knob and pushed. The door swung inward. I stepped backward into the pitch-black space. I pulled the closet door shut until the latch clicked. I reached up and turned the small thumb lock. The closet was a claustrophobic box. It was barely wide enough for my shoulders. Shelves holding gallon jugs of cleaning solution pressed against my back. The dark air smelled strongly of ammonia and old dust. I stood in the pitch black, taking shallow, silent breaths. I listened through the thin wooden door. The bathroom outside was quiet, except for the continuous splashing of the water from the far sink. 2 minutes passed. The darkness in the closet offered a terrible, suffocating comfort. I was hidden. The mimic had not followed me. I kept my hand resting on the metal lock, waiting for the courage to open the door and run. Then the heavy main door of the restroom squeaked open. "Hey, you in here?" It was David, the overnight security guard. His voice was loud, bouncing off the tile walls. I heard his heavy leather boots step onto the wet floor. "Dispatch needs a radio check from the lower level. Your radio battery die?" Relief washed over me. The presence of another person shattered the isolation. I opened my mouth to call out his name. I wanted to tell him to hold the door open so I could run out. I gripped the lock, ready to turn it, but I stopped. David took another step into the room. He called my name again. His voice was steady and annoyed. He was standing near the front sinks, looking for me. Beneath his voice, cutting through the droning hum of the lights, I heard a sound. It was the sharp, distinct noise of water splashing against porcelain. But the far sink had stopped running. I stood frozen in the dark closet, my hand gripping the cold metal lock, listening to the sharp sound of splashing water coming from directly beside his boots. The handheld laser scanner issued a high tone confirming a successful read, but its black battery pack was sitting on the folding desk. I stood in the center of the warehouse overflow room. My job was simple inventory audit. I counted boxes of seasonal decorations and scanned the paper barcodes glued to the cardboard. The handheld unit was a gray plastic block with a glass window at the front. The battery slot on the bottom of the handle was empty. I stared at the dark hole. I looked at the plastic battery pack resting next to my clipboard. A device without a power source cannot read a barcode. It cannot emit a laser. It cannot sound a tone. I placed the scanner on the desk. My training required me to document all equipment failures. I picked up my pen and wrote a note on the audit log. Hardware malfunction. I blamed a residual charge left in the internal capacitor. It was the only logical answer. The company used cheap tools, and cheap tools broke down often. I focused on the paperwork to ignore the strange feeling in my gut. The back room was vast. It was not designed for retail customers. It was a concrete box the size of a football field. The ceiling was lost in shadows. Tall metal racks filled the space, creating a labyrinth of narrow aisles. Pallets of cardboard boxes were stacked 3 levels high. The air smelled of dry cardboard and dust. The only light came from the scattered bulbs hanging over the main walkways. The deep corners of the room were pitch black. I picked up my clipboard and turned around to count the next aisle. The ventilation system died. The continuous drone of the air conditioner faded into nothing. The sudden silence was absolute. It pressed against my ears. I stopped walking. I took a deep breath, inhaling the dry warehouse air. I let the breath out through my nose. Far down the dark aisle to my left, a large cardboard box scraped against the concrete floor. I froze. I stared down the narrow row of pallets. The light did not reach the end of the aisle. I held my clipboard tight. I thought it was just the boxes settling. Sometimes the humidity made the cardboard soft, and the stacks shifted under their own weight. I tried to convince myself that an old building makes noise. I took another breath. I exhaled. Another box scraped against the floor. It was closer this time. I gripped the edge of the metal rack next to me. I did not move my feet. I waited. The warehouse was silent again. The static hum of the lights was gone. I tested a theory. I tapped my pen against the metal clip of the board. The metal struck the clip with a sharp tap. Right away, 3 large boxes shifted in the dark. The sound of cardboard sliding on concrete echoed through the aisle. The anomaly registered in my mind. Whatever was hiding in the dark maze was reacting to sound. Every noise I made caused it to move. If I stayed silent, it stayed still. If I made a sound, it advanced. I stopped breathing. I stood locked in place. I clamped my lips shut. The terror forced my heart to race, pumping blood hard against my neck. Even the sound of my own pulse felt too loud in the dead quiet of the room. I stared into the dark gap between the metal racks. I could not see a shape. I could not see a shadow. I just knew it was there, waiting for a cue. I needed to get to the loading dock. The fire exit was located at the far end of the labyrinth, but my work boots had thick rubber soles. If I walked, the rubber would scrape on the concrete. If I ran, the boots would strike the floor with loud thuds. Every step would draw it closer. I leaned against the metal rack. I moved at a slow pace. I bent my knees, keeping my joints rigid to avoid making a sound. I reached down to my left boot. I untied the laces. I slid the leather off my heel and set the boot softly on the floor. I did the same with my right boot. I stood up in my socks. The concrete floor was freezing against my feet. I stood still, waiting to see if the rustle of my clothes gave me away. Nothing moved. The boxes stayed silent. Then, the air in the aisle changed. A strange energy built up around me. It felt like standing near an old television screen. The air turned charged and tight. I felt a static current travel up my arms. The fine hairs on my skin stood straight up, pulling tight against my sleeves. The static made my skin crawl. The temperature did not drop, but cold sweat broke out across my forehead. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled. The air pressure dropped. I felt a shift right next to my left shoulder. A low, wet exhale brushed against my ear. It felt like hot steam. It smelled of raw meat and damp soil. I abandoned my protocol. I abandoned the silence. I dropped the clipboard. I turned and sprinted toward the loading dock. My shocked feet hit the concrete floor in rapid succession. I did not care about the noise anymore. I ran without looking through the maze. I took a sharp right turn at the end of the aisle, tearing past stacks of holiday trees. Behind me, the labyrinth erupted. Dozens of boxes smashed into the floor. The metal racks shrieked as they were pushed aside. Something massive was tearing through the narrow aisles, crushing the pallets in its way. It was tracking the sound of my running feet. I saw the red glow of the fire exit sign suspended in the dark. I focused on the red light. My lungs burned. I forced my legs to push harder. The concrete tore at the fabric of my socks, scraping the skin on my toes. The sound of breaking metal behind me grew louder, gaining ground with every second. I reached the metal door. I threw my hands against the crash bar. I pushed hard. The door unlatched and swung outward. I threw myself through the opening and tumbled onto the rough asphalt of the alley. I rolled onto my back, kicking the metal door shut with my heel. The thick latch engaged. The door was locked from the outside. I lay on the cold ground. The alley was quiet. The moon cast a pale glow over the brick walls of the building. The night air was cool and fresh, smelling of city rain and exhaust. I took deep, gasping breaths, pulling the safe air into my lungs. The frantic chase was over. I was outside. I was alone in the quiet alley. The warehouse was sealed. I sat up. I rested my back against the brick wall next to the fire door. My heart rate began to slow. The adrenaline faded, leaving my muscles weak and shaking. I wiped the sweat from my eyes. I looked at the solid steel door. It was a thick barrier. Nothing was getting through it. I felt a wave of profound relief. I survived the shift. I was safe. I pushed myself up from the asphalt. I stood next to the door. I reached out and placed my bare palm flat against the cold steel surface to push myself away from the wall. The final reality was the violent, rapid vibration of something gigantic scratching frantic circles into the steel on the other side, sending a painful tremor straight up the bones of my arm. I pulled the exact same red toddler shoe out of the sorting bin for the third time in 10 minutes. I sat on a metal stool inside the lost and found storage room. The space was nothing more than a converted closet located near the mall security office. It was terribly small. The walls were lined with metal racks packed tight with forgotten winter coats, scarves, and umbrellas. The air smelled of damp wool and old dust. I had a small folding desk pushed against the back wall. A large plastic bin sat on the floor next to my knees. My job was to sort the abandoned items, log them in a paper ledger, and throw away the garbage. I held the small red shoe under the single overhead bulb. It was made of cheap canvas. It had a white rubber toe cap and 2 hook and loop straps across the top. The left strap was frayed at the edge. A small piece of dried mud clung to the heel. I stared at it. I had pulled this exact shoe out of the bin 5 minutes ago, and I had pulled it out 5 minutes before that. I placed the shoe on the metal desk. I told myself it was just a terrible statistical coincidence. The mall saw thousands of families every weekend. That brand of shoe was mass-produced and sold at the discount store on the first floor. It was logical to assume 3 different toddlers lost the same style of left shoe in the same week. The frayed strap and the mud were just common wear patterns for kids that age. I refused to let my mind wander into strange territory. I picked the red shoe up from the desk. I dropped it into the gray plastic trash can sitting near the door. I watched it land on a pile of crumpled paper receipts. The tiny closet began to grow warm. I reached back into the large plastic bin. I pulled out a black leather glove. I wrote the description in the paper ledger. I placed the glove on the desk. As I wrote, a drop of sweat rolled down the side of my face. I wiped it away with the back of my hand. The room had no air vents. The door was closed to keep out the noise of the main corridor. I figured the building reduced the air conditioning for the night, trapping the heat in the small spaces. I unbuttoned the top of my work shirt. I grabbed a folded mall directory from the desk and fanned my face. The air did not cool down. The heat pressed against my skin. It felt like sitting in a parked car under the summer sun. The temperature climbed higher with every passing minute. I tossed the directory aside. I reached into the plastic bin to grab the next item. My fingers brushed against rough canvas and a rubber toe cap. I pulled my hand back. I looked down into the bin. Sitting right on top of a folded denim jacket was the red toddler shoe. The left strap was frayed. A small piece of dried mud clung to the heel. My breath caught in my throat. I looked at the gray trash can near the door. The trash can was empty. The crumpled receipts were gone. The red shoe was gone. I looked back at the plastic bin. The shoe was sitting right there, waiting to be sorted. The rational excuses dissolved. The rules of time and probability were breaking down inside the small room. A cold spike of dread hit my stomach, but the air around me continued to cook. I did not want to look at the shoe. I did not want to touch it again. I needed a distraction to keep my mind from breaking. I needed a repetitive task to act as a shield against the rising panic. I stood up from the stool. I turned my back to the plastic bin. I grabbed a massive pile of forgotten winter coats from the corner shelf. I grabbed a handful of wire hangers. I started hanging the coats. I moved fast. I slid a wire hanger into the shoulders of a gray wool coat. I forced the zipper up. I hung it on the metal rack. I grabbed a green jacket. I shoved the hanger inside. I hung it up. I focused all my attention on the rough texture of the fabrics and the sharp scrape of the metal hangers sliding across the rack. I kept my eyes fixed on the wall. I refused to turn around. If I kept working, I was safe. If I ignored the bin, the loop would break. The heat in the closet became blistering. It escalated from a warm room to an open furnace. The air burned my nostrils when I inhaled. Sweat poured down my forehead, stinging my eyes. My shirt clung to my back, soaked through with moisture. The tight walls of the closet felt like they were radiating fire. The smell of the damp wool coats intensified, creating a suffocating odor of wet sheep and dust. I hung another coat. My hands were shaking. The metal hanger slipped from my wet fingers and struck the floor. I bent down to pick it up, but the heat rushing to my head made me dizzy. The room spun. The air was so hot I felt my skin start to flush and tighten. The heat was unbearable. It drained the energy out of my muscles. I could not stand up straight. I could not hide in the routine anymore. The heat was cooking me alive. Defeated and exhausted, I dropped the pile of coats. I turned around. I sat back down on the metal stool. My legs felt weak. I wiped the stinging sweat from my eyes and looked at the metal desk. The red toddler shoe was resting in the center of the desk. I had not put it there. The frayed strap hung loose. The blistering heat in the room seemed to pulse outward from the small object. I sat in the stifling air, staring at the cheap canvas. I leaned forward. I reached my hand out. I placed my index finger inside the opening of the small shoe. The final realization was the mundane, nauseating fact that the inside of the tiny shoe was soaking wet with hot sweat, as if a small foot had just slipped out of it a second ago. The mechanical stairs were feeding upward, but the metal treads dissolved into nothing before reaching the top landing. I stood at the base of the multi-level atrium, holding a heavy grease gun in my right hand. The mall was closed. The night shift was the only time we could run open maintenance on the main transport lines. The atrium was a massive, open void in the center of the building. The floor was covered in smooth white tile. The ceiling 3 stories above was made of dark glass panels. The space was dead quiet. The only noise was the low, steady hum of the escalator motor driving the chain track. My job was to lubricate the lower gears and inspect the step alignment. I had the lower access panel open. I held the maintenance key in the control slot. I watched the stairs rise from the bottom floor, climb the steep incline, and travel toward the second level. I looked at the top landing. A normal escalator feeds the metal steps under a steel cone plate, sending them back down the return track hidden underneath. These steps were not sliding under the plate. They were vanishing into a patch of dark, writhing air. I let out a dry laugh. The sound bounced off the glass storefronts around me. I spoke aloud, making a joke to the empty atrium. I said a drive belt snapped in the worst possible way, pulling the steps off the track. I used denial to shield my mind from what my eyes were seeing. I gripped the cold metal barrel of the grease gun. I told myself it was just a shadow cast by a burnt-out spotlight on the second floor. I stepped closer to the rubber handrail. I looked up the incline. The metal steps kept rising. The grooved aluminum caught the dim security lights. As each step reached the patch of dark air, the metal lost its shape. The rigid edges melted. The yellow-painted warning lines blurred. The step just ceased to exist, swallowed by a dark blur that hovered right above the top landing. A foul taste hit the back of my throat. It was sharp and metallic, like biting down on a sheet of dirty copper foil. I swallowed hard, but the taste clung to my tongue. It tasted like old sour grease mixed with battery acid. My stomach churned. The flavor was so strong it made my eyes water. I looked away from the top landing. I reached down to my canvas tool bag sitting on the tile floor. I needed a shop rag to wipe my mouth. I kept my eyes on the bag for about 5 seconds. I found a red cloth, pulled it out, and wiped my lips. The fabric offered no relief. I stood up straight and looked back at the escalator. The dark patch was no longer at the top landing. It had moved down the stairs. It was now taking up the top 5 steps of the incline. The steps below it continued to feed upward, marching right into the writhing blur and melting away. My breath caught in my chest. The dark air was not a shadow. It was an absence of light, a thick void that seemed to churn like boiling water, and it was moving closer to me. I realized the mechanic of the threat. When I watched it, it stayed anchored to its spot, just consuming the stairs that fed into it. But when I looked away, it crept down the track. I kept my eyes locked on the dark mass. The taste of sour copper grew thicker in my mouth. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I needed to know how fast it moved. I needed to know if I had time to shut off the main power breaker located on the wall behind me. I squeezed my eyes shut for 1 single second. I opened them. The void was 3 steps lower. The mechanical hum of the motor changed. The smooth sound of the drive chain turned into a wet, grinding noise. It did not sound like metal scraping against metal. It sounded like thick bone snapping under extreme pressure. The terrible sound echoed in the massive empty atrium, filling the space with a sickening rhythm. I dropped the grease gun. The heavy tool hit the white tile. I did not care about the power breaker anymore. I did not care about the broken stairs. The urge to flee overtook every ounce of my professional training. I just wanted to put the thick glass doors of the main entrance between me and the grinding void. I spun around. I broke my line of sight. I sprinted toward the main mall entrance. The doors were 100 feet away. My work boots slapped hard against the smooth tile floor. I pumped my arms, pushing my legs as fast as they could move. The taste of copper grease flooded my nose and throat with every panicked breath I drew. Behind me, the grinding sound of snapping bone grew louder. It was no longer confined to the escalator track. It was moving across the floor. I kept my eyes fixed on the glass doors. Outside, parked under a lone street lamp, I saw the white security patrol car. The engine was running. Through the windshield, I could see the overnight guard asleep in the driver's seat, his head tilted back against the headrest. That was safety. That was another human being. I ran past the row of empty massage chairs. I ran past a closed coffee kiosk. The exit was only 30 feet away. I reached into my pocket for my master key ring to unlock the deadbolt on the glass doors. My boot clipped the heavy metal base of a fallen velvet rope stanchion. I lost my balance. My arms flailed. I pitched forward and slammed hard into the tile floor. The impact knocked the wind out of my lungs. My knees scraped against the hard surface. The metal keys flew out of my hand, sliding across the floor and stopping just short of the glass doors. I rolled onto my back. I scrambled backward, pushing with my heels, trying to slide toward the keys. The dark void slithered across the white tile. It was a massive, churning mass of black air, moving fast. It produced no wind. It cast no shadow. But the grinding sound of breaking bone radiated from its center. I pressed my back against the bottom frame of the glass doors. I pulled my knees up to my chest. I threw my arms over my face. I braced for the cold. I braced for the crushing weight. I waited for the dark mass to consume me. The void rushed right over my legs. It did not stop. It did not grab me. It passed over my boots without physical weight. The temperature dropped for a brief second, and then the mass hit the glass doors. It did not break the glass. It simply melted through the solid pane, leaving the metal frame untouched. I lowered my arms. I sat on the cold tile, gasping for air. I watched the dark void rush across the exterior concrete sidewalk. It moved straight toward the parked patrol car. It flowed over the hood. It seeped through the windshield. The security guard jerked awake. His hands flew up to grab the steering wheel. Then the dark mass filled the interior of the car, obscuring him from view. The brake lights flared bright red for a moment, then went dark. I did not stand up. I did not reach for my keys. I sat paralyzed against the glass doors of the empty mall. The massive atrium behind me was dead quiet. The grinding sound was gone. I just sat there in the silence, tasting the thick, sour copper grease coating the back of my dry tongue. The brass master key slid into the office deadbolt, but refused to turn. I stood in the narrow hallway at the back of the retail store. I was the closing shift manager. It was an hour past midnight. The rest of the staff had gone home. The front gates were pulled down and locked. The store lights were reduced to the emergency setting, casting a dim gray glow over the racks of folded clothes. I held the deposit bag in my left hand. I just needed to put the cash in the drop safe, set the alarm, and leave. The back office was a painfully enclosed space. It was a windowless box built out of cheap drywall, tucked under the rear staircase of the building. The room barely held a small metal desk, 2 tall filing cabinets, and the floor safe. The air inside always felt stale, smelling of warm computer towers and old paper. I gripped the round head of the key. I applied pressure to the right. The internal pins of the lock felt rigid. The metal cylinder did not budge. I twisted my wrist harder, the edge of the key digging into my skin. I let go of the key and took a breath. I blamed the jam pin caused by my own stress. I had been dealing with customer returns for 10 hours. My shoulders were tight. My hands felt weak. I told myself it was just cheap hardware failing at the end of a long day. I stepped closer to the door. I placed my left hand flat against the wood panel. I pressed my shoulder against the door frame. I grabbed the key again, hoping that pushing the door inward would relieve the pressure on the deadbolt latch. I leaned my weight forward. Gravity shifted. The change was profound. I felt my inner ear betray me. The floor beneath my boots was flat concrete, but my body felt like it was standing on a steep downward slope. I leaned forward to catch my balance, bracing my hands hard against the wooden door. But the door was perfectly straight. My muscles strained to hold me upright against a downward pull that did not match the physical room. I pushed away from the door. I staggered backward into the center of the cramped office. I dropped the deposit bag. It hit the floor near the metal desk. I grabbed the edge of the desk to steady myself. The feeling of falling forward remained. It was a terrible, dizzying pull. I assumed I was having a severe dizzy spell from skipping dinner. I kept my eyes open, trying to focus on a fixed point to calm the vertigo. I looked at the filing cabinets resting against the far wall. The metal drawers were stretching. It was a slow, sickening distortion. The standard 4-foot-tall cabinet elongated upward, sliding along the drywall. The handles stretched into long metal ovals. The top of the cabinet reached 6 feet, then 8 feet. The metal groaned as it warped, bending into a tall, unnatural obelisk. I looked at the desk under my hands. The fake wood-grain surface was pulling away from me. The rectangular top stretched into a long, narrow plank. The metal legs bowed outward. The walls of the office followed. The drywall elongated, pulling the ceiling higher and higher into the shadows. The room was rejecting its own geometry. The space was stretching out, becoming a distorted tunnel. The pull of gravity grew worse. I felt like I was hanging off the side of a cliff, even though my boots were planted flat on the carpet. The fear washed over me in cold waves. The architecture of the building was breaking apart. I thought the walls were going to collapse inward and crush me. I let go of the desk. I dropped to my hands and knees. The floor felt solid. but the room around me continued to warp. I crawled under the desk, seeking the tightest, most enclosed space I could find. I pulled my knees to my chest. I wrapped my arms around my head. The space under the desk was dark. The air was hot and suffocating. I squeezed my eyes shut. I hid in the dark, waiting for the structural shifting to stop. I told myself to just breathe. I waited for the strange pull of gravity to correct itself. I waited for the walls to snap back to their normal size. Minutes passed. The groaning sound of bending metal and stretching drywall faded into silence. The office grew still. The terrible feeling of falling slowly faded. My sense of balance leveled out. I felt centered again. I kept my eyes closed in the pitch-black space under the desk. The panic began to recede, replaced by a hollow, exhausted resignation. I thought the dizzy spell had finally passed. I thought my mind had just projected the warping room due to the vertigo. I uncurled my arms. I stayed sitting on the floor under the desk. I needed to check myself before I tried to stand up. I needed to make sure I had not hit my head when I staggered away from the door. I raised my right hand. I reached up in the darkness. I placed my palm against my forehead. The skin was cold and damp with sweat. My fingers felt my hairline. Everything felt normal. I moved my hand down to my cheek. I felt the curve of my cheekbone. I slid my fingers down to the edge of my jaw. I traced the bone toward my chin, but my hand kept moving downward. The bone did not stop. It extended past where my chin used to be. My fingers traced a long, rigid line of bone stretching downward in the dark. I moved my hand further down, touching the stretched, taut skin of my own face. The final sensation was feeling my own jawbone stretching downwards, elongating endlessly into the dark to perfectly match the newly warped dimensions of the room.